I've been a Brooklyn resident since 1975, but my family has, my close family has established residency from 1941. My uncle and aunt moved here in 1941. And what I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be talking to you briefly and then receiving questions about the history of the Quander family. And the best way to do it perhaps is to start off with a slide presentation that will help to convey to you who we are and so on and so forth about the Quander family. Now you're looking here at the first slide, which is just put up there to set the tone for what you're looking at of the educational history and society. And I ask you to go ahead, as I say next, we'll put up each slide to give you a little bit as to the family. So the Quander story, preserving an American legacy. As I tell people all the time, when I go do African-American history and culture related events, I say, just as I told my group today, I said, when I talked about the family, I said, this is not an African-American history story as much as it is an American history story told from an African-American perspective, because we are preserving, we are first of all establishing, we're sharing, we're documenting, and we are preserving our shared American history to pass it on, not only within our own family, but to inspire, hopefully to inspire those who are not part of our family or the generations who come after. Next. Our family story begins in Maryland, documented in 1670s in Port Tobacco, but it's rather just a reference to our presence. So we are documented from 1684, where Henry Adams, a colonial legislator from England, wrote his will. And in the will, he provided for the freedom of two of his four enslaved, Henry Quander, D-O, not E-R, and Margaret Pug. She subsequently married him. And thus they started the presence of the family established here in the New World in Charles County, Maryland. And in 1984, we celebrated our 300th documented year, 1684, 1984. I will not interpret the individual items you see in the family coat of arms there, but each one is significant as to Ghana, West Africa, which is where we came from, and here in Maryland and Virginia. And of course, everything there at the bottom is both basically tied together. We are many, but we are one. Next. We have celebrated, and we now have the 96th Quander family reunion coming up later next month. Actually, it'll be virtual again, unfortunately. But we have had an annual Quander family reunion since 1926, and it's been alternately here in this immediate area or in the Pennsylvania area. And what happened around right after 1900, some of the family went north to get above the Mason-Dixon line, and they started in 1926 having reunions above the Mason-Dixon line in 1926 and below the Mason-Dixon line after that. And we have the Maryland Quanders and the Virginia Quanders. We are two different branches of the same family. So now we celebrate this event together, and we're getting ready for the first weekend in August of next month. Next slide. And the early history of the family, I said 1684, let's take it up to 1863, which of course we realize that's emancipation. Next slide. You can't read it, but this is an extract of the last will and testament of Henry Adams, the colonial legislator that I mentioned, who was in Port Tobacco, Maryland, wrote this document, Charles County, providing for the manumission of Henry Quander and Margaret Pug, later Henry's wife. Our name was spelled D-O in the old records, which is a repetition of the history of the Akan language in Ghana, where we are known as the Amkwandos. And what we believe happened when the forebear was asked his name and replied, Amkwando, they thought he was saying, I'm not understanding the Akan, I am Quando, I am Quando. So the old records carry D-O, and around 1800, it changed to E-R, and occasionally E-R-S. So here is the will of 1684, and at the bottom, you see they are marked freedom for Henry Quander and Margaret Pug. So he provided for their freedom. He died in 1686, and from that day forward, they were free. Now there were two brothers, so the other brother was enslaved, and he did not get his freedom. So consequently, we subsequently have a free line developing and a enslaved line developing. Next. As of course, this is the wheel carrying on to the second page. So continue, next slide. And as they were free, they had to do something. And obviously most people in that particular era and time were farmers. So here you see an extract from the will, not the will, the deed of Ignatius Wheeler. I guess those of you who have been here a while, you know Wheeler Road is the same family. Ignatius Wheeler deeding a parcel of their land to the Quander family in 1695. So they got a 99-year lease, which gave Henry Quander and whoever was working with him a freehold for 99 years. It's not a total ownership. We speculate, but we don't know for sure that at that point, with slavery and discrimination against enslaved Africans who happen to be now free, not being yet fully in place, there's a good chance that he might have been able to vote. But whether he could or not, he is documented and showing himself as present and establishing some significant degree of entrepreneurship. So that is something that we're quite proud of. Next. So this particular person, this man is Charles Henry Quander. Now, I'm sorry that the picture isn't better, but this gentleman was enslaved in Virginia. It was born about 1843. And he is the man for whom Quander Road in Alexandria, Virginia is named. He got his freedom in 1863, like everybody else, but they didn't tell him. And as in Juneteenth, as we know, that was held back in terms of people being able to get their freedom, even though he was freed under the Emancipation Proclamation, 1863, and couldn't leave until the war ended, 1865. They tried to hold it back against him for another year and a half. But when he became aware of it and was ready to leave, they offered him money to stay. And he did take the money, and then he left. And he went over and bought the land along Quander Road, the beginning of the 88-acre farm, that some of which land is still owned by the family today. Charles Henry Quander, 1843, 1919. Look at him and keep him in mind, because we're going to revisit him again. Next. Middle history. Next. The Mount Vernon Ladies Association are the owners of the Mount Vernon, George Washington's Mount Vernon. A lot of people think it's of government owned or state owned, but it's totally privately owned. So in 1983, they dedicated this monument to the formerly enslaved who served George Washington. And the date of death, George Washington had under his control 317 enslaved Africans, men, women, and children. 123 of those were his, and the others were people who were rented or people who Martha Washington brought through her dower with the Custis family. And so this monument, dedicated September 21st, 1983, is the result of an architectural contest at Howard University, in which 3 or 4 teams of students submitted a documented proposed design for the creation of an upright memorial rather. And David Edge, who was a senior at the time, headed a team. And of course, Dean Harry Robinson coordinated with all of the teams. And this is the memorial that's there today and dedicated in 1983. They had a previous one dedicated in 1929, which is a flat one. And because it was overgrown and not tended to, it kind of disappeared. But now that this memorial is here and it's next to it, it has reappeared and we recognize it. There are about 155 people allegedly buried in that burial site, about 125 feet from George Washington's burial. And although there are no records because people were not able to read and write, inside of our family, our oral tradition has about 5 of the Quander ancestors buried in that site at Mount Vernon. Next. Now, this gentleman here is Lewis Quander. Lewis Quander is a direct descendant of Nancy Carter Quander and Charles Quander, and he was a logger. If you're going down to Mount Vernon, you're doing on the Mount Vernon Highway, and that predecessor road was the railbed road for the train that used to run down to Mount Vernon. And Lewis Quander was one of those many men who was a freeborn man of Charles, a son of Charles and Nancy Quander. But as a logger, he helped to clear the road that eventually resulted in the railbed being laid so that the train could go down to Mount Vernon, And now the Mount Vernon Highway, which is the train doesn't go with the Mount Vernon Highway Parkway, follows pretty much the same road. So ancestrally, he contributed to the creation of that road that runs along the river. Next. This gentleman here, Corporal John Pearson Quander, we have a long history of Quanders in military service. And this gentleman served in the Civil War. He was born in 1845, signed up on his birthday in 1863, and was a Civil War veteran. And he is the father, or was the father, of Nellie Quander. If you know Nellie Quander, she was the first national president of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And I believe I have a slide of her showing up, but if I don't have it on here, that is her father. And this picture is him in 1915 in his uniform when the Grand Army of the Republic reunion in 1915. And he was selected to speak and deliver a keynote address on behalf of the colored soldiers who had served in the Civil War. And here he is posing either before or after that speech. Next. Now, of course, you wouldn't have much history if you didn't have some colorful people in the family. And we had our share. We have our great heroes and we have our not so great heroes. But it's some of those not so great heroes who create all kinds of disturbances that are the most interesting and end up in the paper. And one of those was Felix Quander. Felix Quander was a Quander who, well, let's say, put it this way, he didn't march to the tune of the drummer that everybody else marched to. He was constantly in trouble. He allegedly was stealing things, and he was always maintaining that he wasn't stealing things. He was simply recapturing the property that had been taken from him, and he was taking the property back. And that went on over and over and over. And of course, that gave us a lot to recognize. And in the book that I've written, which you're going to hear about in a few minutes, he is a very colorful character. He gets a lot of press and print. And this article here is just referring to one of the things that he is alleged to have been involved in with the theft. This one I'm not reading carefully. I'm not reading it at the point. Between theft of a chicken or chickens, plural, theft of a cow or beating an animal or something of that nature. There are numerous articles, and he is very colorful, paints a full story. And it is very interesting reading. I have the extract of it in the book, which is coming up. Next. Early 20th century. Okay, here we are at Mount Vernon. This is cousin Susie Quander. Susie Quander is there at Mount Vernon, and she is there standing with her class. You don't see the class, but it's the Barnett Patterson class of 1932, and she's standing on the lawn. Now you have to understand, maybe you do, maybe you don't, the Quander family is alleged to be related by blood to George Washington. George Washington's nephew, Bushrod Washington, inherited the Mount Vernon plantation from his uncle, George Washington. When George Washington died in 1799, Bushrod Washington took over. He waited till Martha died, but he came in 1802. And he is the alleged father of West Ford. You might have heard that name. But West Ford is definitely the ancestor of the Quander family from Mount Vernon. So Nellie Quander, who you haven't seen yet, and Susie, her sister, are two of those descendants who are directly descended from West Ford and allegedly Bushrod Washington. There has been no DNA test conducted because there's certain people who would prefer not to know, if you get the message. Okay. Next. This lady here is Emma Quander Hawkins. She is one of the Maryland Quanders. She was the treasurer of North Brentwood, Maryland for several years, and her husband, Jeremiah Hawkins, was the first African-American mayor of North Brentwood, Maryland. Next. This is her brother, Dr. John Thomas Quander, medical doctor. He graduated from Howard University in the class of 1909, and unfortunately passed away of tuberculosis in 1910. But the point is that he was very much involved with being, on the forefront of medicine and accomplishment, and carrying the message in terms of what we as a race of people in general, and we as in the family in particular, have set about accomplishing. And here you see Dr. John Thomas Quander. That's his class picture from the yearbook. Next. This is cousin James Quander standing at the door of one of the houses we had in Upper Marlboro, Merrill Circle around 1910. This house is gone, did not have plumbing, electricity, or heat, but the house across from it, which you don't see in this picture, also did not, but it's still functional. So we added plumbing, we added heat, we added electricity. But as I was growing up, the outhouse was still there. The water pump was still outside. Now it's inside. But here he is. This is Christmas Day, and it's about 1910. Next. Later 21st and early 20th and early 21st century. Next. Now, the Quanders have been to the Smithsonian. Well, let me back it up. People say, oh, Quander family in the Smithsonian Museum now? The answer is no, not at the moment. But why not? I said, wait a minute, we've been in there 3 times. So let's give somebody else a chance. So we have been in the American Museum, the Smithsonian Anacostia Museum. We've been in 3 times. This lady is Sadie Chin Quander. She married into the family, lived on Quander Road. That's Dr. John Thomas Quander's plaque. I told you he died in 1910, tuberculosis. That's a picture of Frederick Douglass lent to us by the Douglass family. In the lower right, there's a set of tongs that were ice tongs used by the Diggs family as they had a business in Prince George's County. And the piece de resistance is that typewriter. That typewriter is a typewriter that Buck Franklin used. He was a lawyer. He was John Hope Franklin's father, and he's John Franklin, who's at the Smithsonian's grandfather. Buck Franklin used that typewriter to report the burning down of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 1921. And those are items that the Smithsonian has that were put on display as promotion for that exhibit, Precious Memory Collector's Passion, 2002. Next. The Door of No Return. When we went and had the reunion with the Quando family in Ghana, I was there in 1991. I've been to Africa 7 times, but this is from that particular picture. I'm standing in the door of no return through which the enslaved Africans were pushed through onto longboats to go out to be put on the ships where they never, ever saw their homeland again. And when we took that picture, we were in the dark and it captures the light so you can see exactly what it was like. And the Door of No Return, I saw the one in Senegal also. This particular one is at the Elmina Castle in Cape Coast, Ghana. Okay, next. There's the moat right there. In fact, that's the ocean right there. That's the same castle. And that moat across the walkway there was a moat, and still is a moat, but it had water in it. And they put crocodiles in there. So if you thought you were going to escape, better watch out. You would be breakfast, you might be lunch or dinner if there was anything left for dinner. Next. There I am at Mount Vernon, the exhibit Lives Bound Together, Slavery at George Washington's Mount Vernon. That exhibit opened in October 1st, 2016, and it was only going to be there for 2 years. And after 4 years and 10 months, they just closed it last week, and they're putting in another exhibit coming in the fall. So it's focused on the lives of the enslaved at Mount Vernon. It looks at the lives of the enslaved as they contributed rather than the Washingtons. And it shows you that on the date of death, there were 317 enslaved at the 5 Mount Vernon plantations that we call Mount Vernon collectively, supporting 5 Washingtons. And as a tour guide, I'm right there, all white, and you see me standing there. Well, actually, that was a reunion because that's a badge. Quander family reunion. We were their guests of the Mount Vernon Ladies Association, and I had on my green and white badge at that particular day, pointing to Nancy Quander, whose name was etched on the entranceway. Next. My wife and I go to Mount Vernon for some activities from time to time, and there I am in tuxedo, my wife standing there. We're at an invitational event related to a book signing or some other event some years ago, when we do attend those from time to time. Next. There I am at Lives Bound Together. That's a holograph of Nancy Carter Quander. We don't know what the people look like, but when you went through the exhibit, each one of the 19 featured, who represented the 317 in total, had a little blurb on that particular person. And I'm standing there, and that holograph represents Nancy, and we don't know what any of these people look like. So they are in the shadows, and that's symbolic because it means They were there, but they were not seen. They would not speak until they were spoken to. Next. Now, this lady here, this is Gladys Quander Tansel. She was the first African-American interpreter guide at Mount Vernon. She is, of course, is my cousin. And you see her here speaking to a group, and she's smiling, talking to them. And this is in the plaque that's on the wall. It was a big, I forget the right word we used, but it was laid up there with different people in various presentations doing various things. Now, remember, I told you to remember the man who was sitting on the buckboard, and I said Charles Henry Quander. Well, this is his granddaughter, Gladys Quander Tansel. And the theme of my book cover is from the outhouse, and he represents the outhouse, to the White House, because she ultimately will be in the Oval Office with President Clinton and me and others. Next. That is one of the many reproductions of structures that were there that are borne out. And here, this was a reproduction of one of the original slave cabins that had rotted, but they were able to rebuild it based on photographs. I dedicated that 2007. Next. We're almost finished with the slides. We'll have general conversation in a minute. Okay, this house is on Quander Road. This is one of the many houses that was in the family on Quander Road. And this house was just torn down last year because the county bought it. And that park is right where this is Quander Park now. And down the hill behind the house is a stream, and it's called Quander Brook. All of this is on Quander Road, the 88 acres of land that the family once owned, several pieces of which are divvied up. And on that, we have West Potomac Park High School on Quander Road and Quander Road Elementary School. Next. There I am in Ghana. See, I had hair then. I wonder what happened. I'm in Ghana, West Africa, with some of my Quander cousins in Accra. Next. And civic service and education. Next. Quander Street. A little hard to see it, but there are 4 Quander streets. And this particular one was from Prince William County. That is Quander Road in Fairfax County that I just referenced again. Then in Bowie, there's Quander's Promised Lane. And in Washington, D.C., there is a restoration as of 2015 with a sign installed as of June last month, Quander Street. As soon as you come out of the baseball stadium to go to the Metro, if you go to the right, you have to walk past Quander Street to get to the Metro. If you go to the left, you won't see it. So next time you go down there, be sure to go to the right, Quander Street. It was there from the 1890s. It was the first one, actually. And then when they expanded during World War II to build the expansion on the Navy Yard, they took 2 streets out of existence, and Quander was one of them. And they put it back, and it's there now. Next. Okay, there we are in the Oval Office with President Clinton and Senator Robb of Virginia and Vice President Gore. And that is the Black Women United for Action. And we presented a replica of the slave memorial to President Clinton. And the lady in blue is the same one who was the interpreter guide. Next. This lady is Nellie Quander, first national president of the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority. And I wrote that book to coincide with the AK Centennial. And I have that book available also for those who are interested. Next. There we are, Quander Road and Emmett Drive. That's in Alexandria, Virginia. Next. That's the Quander building on Quander Road, and that's West Potomac Park High School. Next. And that's the Quander Road School Elementary School down the hill. Next. Military history. Next. Again, you see the Civil War veteran Nellie Quander's father, Corporal John Pearson Quander. Next. The gentleman on the right, Charles Johnson Quander, says second from the right, but he is the far right, Tuskegee Airman. We have 2 Tuskegee Airmen in the Quander family, one on my mother's side. So he is one of the 2 Tuskegee Airmen in the family. Next. There we are, Quanders in military service. In one of my family reunions, I set up that exhibit. Next. The gentleman second from the left, Richard Ignatius Quander. He was a career military veteran and served in the Spanish-American War and in World War I. He was a great musician And as you see a picture with him and his fellow musicians from the U.S. Army Band. I don't know when that picture was taken, but it was after the Spanish-American War and before World War I. Next. This is Peter Mercer Quander, who served in World War I. Next. We are the only family that we know of, and perhaps in the country, that has 4 generals. And today I understand there's going to be a 5th one. If you see them on the left, they don't have the last name of Quander, not all of them. That's Leo Brooks, General Leo Brooks. The one on the right is General Leo Brooks Jr. The one second from the left is Vincent Keith Brooks. The one on the second from the right is General Mark Quander, and that tall guy in the middle is yours truly. We have the very good distinction of having all 4 of them are United States generals or retired. And the gentleman on the far right was the 2nd African-American commandant of West Point, served from 2002 to 2004, the 2nd highest rank at West Point. And the general on the far right, on the second from the right, Mark Quander, General Mark Quander, is the 3rd African-American commandant at West Point, installed in May of this year. So we had 2 commandants. And Vincent Keith Brooks, if you know who he is, second from the left, he was in charge of all of the South Korean forces until he retired just recently. Next. Religious life. Next. Quanders have been very involved in a number of churches. The Maryland Quanders have a tradition of being a strong Catholic family. This is the St. Mary's Catholic Church in Upper Marlboro, Maryland, where we've been since the 1820s. This is the, quote, new church, because the old church burned down. Old and new is relative. This church is 1899. And the window on the door on the right, the white door on the right, was the so-called colored entrance. So because of segregation, it is in the South, all the blacks had to go into that entrance for the purpose of worship. And the stained glass window between the 2 white doors is a window put there by the Quander family and others. Next, I think it is the next slide. That's the window put there, stained glass window. No, it isn't. This is a historical marker. I'll come back to the stained glass window. The building across the street, because of restrictions on us using the church, we built our own building, and it's across the street, and it's on the National Register of Historic Places now, but this is the register for Prince George's County. Next. Okay, I'll mention the stained glass window. When you go inside, you can see it was given by the Beneficial Society, colored, and it's a beautiful stained glass window. The Virginia Quanders have a long history with Alfred Street Baptist Church and several Methodist churches. So this is Alfred Street Baptist Church. Next. Only a couple more slides. There's another church, Mount Calvary on Quander Road. Next. My father, second from the right of the first row, when the Roman Catholic Church reinstituted the permanent diaconate after an 800-year absence of not having deacons in the Roman Catholic Church. He was in the very first class. There he is on the front row, James Quander on the right. Quander family reunions, conclusion. There we are at the 85th Quander family reunion. I showed you the cabin that I dedicated in 2007. So when we had the 85th reunion, some of us collected there, and this is the cabin, looking at it from the other side. That's my granddaughter there. You see, look at her looking sideways. Okay, I'm the one with the green hat. My wife is the one with the very nice blouse in red. My son and daughter, my other daughter's not there. Continue, next. And we had our 300th anniversary at Howard University in Blackburn Center in 1984. Next. There I am with with the president of the Quanders at the time during one of our reunions, Rudy Golden. Next. And it was a cake from the 93rd. Next. And also that event, that's a reporter who reported an article in the paper on us. Next. Another family member. Next. And we are where we came in. So now we have 2 other slides that are going to show. Next.
Just give me a sec here.
Okay, just a minute. You see the email to get hold of me. Okay. Now the 2 other slides are going to pop up. And one of them is the actual cover of the book. And the name of the book is The Quander Since 1684, An Enduring African American Legacy. And she's going to show you a slide of that. There it is right there. And you see Charles Henry Quander, dairy farmer. He's standing up with two pictures. And my wife is a professional artist, and she painted this cover. You see her name, Carmen Toya Quander, on the corner there. And the lady looking to the side is his wife. She passed away in 1915. He died in 1919. So this picture was taken a little bit before 1915. And this is on Quander Road. And this is the cover of the book. And of course, the back cover is of us, the same picture you saw in the Oval Office at the White House. Next. Now, the book is being marketed around the country. And this is how you would reach me for those who might be interested. And this is the same picture that covered the book, but to pre-order or to reach me, you can reach me through the website, which will take you to PayPal. You can write a check. You can call me up on the telephone. Get all that information once you go into the website. It gives you all of that. And you can also reach me at info@quanderquality.com. So it's been my pleasure to be part of this today with you. And I would like to engage and have some questions and whatever, some observations, whatever people would like to entertain, and we can do that. And it's been my pleasure to be very much with you today at this time. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. That was fascinating. Yes, and we're getting virtual and real claps.
Good, good.
In this group. I would like to certainly open it up to anyone who has questions, and maybe take the prerogative of the facilitator to ask a first one. I have so many, but I guess.
Can you put the contact information back up?
Sure.
Yes.
Let me share. Here we go. So. I get, did your parents and grandparents talk about the family history? How did you really get into, the history of your family, and how did you do your research?
Okay, well, let's take my mother's side out of it for the conversation, my father's side. My father's side, of course, all the Quanders, and he was born in Washington, D.C. His father, my grandfather, was born in Prince George's County. And growing up, regretfully, my grandfather was orphaned as a child. So he did not have the knowledge of the family history. It was his history, but as a child, he was orphaned by the age of 10 from both parents. So he didn't have that. But there were others in the family who had bits and pieces. And when I went to Howard Law School, I learned some of the art of research. And I began to put it together. Well, first of all, when I went to undergrad, people from West Africa kept calling me Mr. Quando. And I would be correcting them. And one day, one of the students from Ghana said, "You don't even know your history, do you?" I didn't know what he was talking about. He told me my name was a Fonte name. And I talked to some of the older family members, and they said, "Well, yeah, we know somewhere back there." They didn't know where the back there was. And the research proved, didn't necessarily tie it directly there, but it took us all the way back into the 1600s, and where we were right there, where people were beginning to be brought into this country. And we subsequently discovered later, and I researched the Amaquando people in all over Africa, and there's one extended family. They say they trace their roots back to the year 900 or thereabouts. And then in Ghana, particularly, there are people who spell their name exactly the same way we do, because in the Akan language it's KW. But the language wasn't written until the 19th century. So by then, some have already become QU. So we do have people there who are connected to us ancestrally that way, even though we have met a number of them. Yeah. So just more from a series of little pieces and bits and pieces. And once you get a tie in to George Washington and Mount Vernon, then things begin to open up.
Were there any particular stories throughout your research of your family that just really surprised you, shocked you, touched you?
Yes. Well, first of all, I talked about Felix Quander, and I said he was quite a colorful character. So there are about 10, 12 newspaper articles about him and his involvement in various and sundry interactions in Fairfax County. And then too, the history of some of the family in military service not necessarily in the Civil War, but in the Civil War era. And then too, tied to Mount Vernon with Bushrod Washington, allegedly being the father of West Ford, Bushrod Washington, and having West Ford by one of his enslaved women named Venus. So all of these are stories that have come forward. And a very colorful part is about Nellie Quander with the Alpha Kappa Alpha sorority, how she rescued it, how she put it back together, how she served as the president originally of only one chapter at 1911 at Howard. And then when they broke up into two organizations, she was out of office for about 3 months and she came back, reassumed it. So there's a lot of very interesting things going on. And then the family has a history of in education. Just last week, I guess it was 2 weeks ago, they just named an elementary school after one of our relatives, Naomi Brooks, in Fairfax County. She's a Quander. She is the mother, the wife of the Generals Brooks, and the mother of the other two. So the family has a long history, established history in formal education, which we have shared to help lift as we climb.
Thank you. Does anybody have any questions they would like to ask? I don't want to monopolize. Feel free to unmute yourself or raise your virtual hand. Don't be shy.
Yeah, please don't be shy.
Comments about how interesting and fascinating the talk is.
Well, I bark, but I don't bite.
Mr. Quander. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead,
Ann
Ann.
first. Yeah.
This is Ann Gilbride. Mr. Quander, I knew a woman named Algatha Quander. She was a parishioner at St. Anthony's Parish. Is she related to you as well?
Of course. Aunt Algatha was my aunt. She was my father's older brother's wife. And I mentioned about the long standing of the family in Brookland. They bought their house on Hamlin Street in 1941. They moved there in 1941. So Uncle Joe was my father's older brother, and Algatha, and they had 3 sons, Dr. Joseph P. Quander, James Edward Quander, and Jacinta Quander Robinson. But yes, and that particular house did not have a restrictive covenant on it like so many did. And that, if you may know, that's called the Mudd House, because Dr. Samuel Mudd, who fixed John Wilkes Booth's leg and was at one time suspected to be a traitor, his grandson, that was his house, the Mudd House. And Mr. Mudd sold that house to the Quanders in 1941. Yeah. And it was in the family until about 10 years ago. They passed away, and one of my cousins who lives in Texas wasn't interested in keeping it. So it left the family in the early part of the 20th century, 21st century. Yeah. Yes.
Wow.
Thank you.
Alicia, did you have a question?
Yes. First of all, yes, this is so inspiring. Thank you, Judge Quander, for sharing your rich family history with us this evening. Can you guys hear me okay on my phone?
Yes.
Okay. Just a general question. This is something that my family has been trying to do. Well, my aunt is leading this in our family. I'm just curious, what was your timeline in gathering all of this research? That's part one. And part two, along the way, did you have to use any of these sort of commercial genealogy modalities throughout your research?
Okay. I started my personal journey when I was at Howard Law School in 1968. So none of this electronic data, DNA, we didn't have any cell phones, we didn't have computers either. So this was legwork down in the Hall of Records in Annapolis, the Fairfax County Courthouse Archive section, the Archives of the District of Columbia. So it was using fingers and alphabetical indices to go through to begin to craft all of this. As time went on, and what I found out, several people in the family knew a piece here, a piece there. Things began to merge when people had pictures that they let us take pictures of and borrow to put in for family reunions. People had little stories to tell that were recorded. Consequently, I ended up with 800 and some pages of interviews that are with the Smithsonian and other places of history archival collections to begin to get this information. And then when WikiTree and all of these other great things came along, they helped to clarify, fill in the blanks, give us more information on certain things, clarify, even refute things that we had thought were true. And so that has come later, but all of these things that we have now are so much more advantageous to us that we didn't have back in the day of the pencil trial and error period. So please take advantage of everything that's out there and do and follow. Yes. Any other questions?
Yes, Judge Quander, I have a question.
Sure.
My name is Charles McCullough, and just like Alicia said, thank you very much for sharing. This is just very enlightening. Executive Director of Greater Brooklyn Intergenerational Village, we love hearing about generations of families here in Brookland. So my two questions for you are, with regard to the manumission document, that is just an extraordinarily rare thing to have. How did you come across, how did your family come across finding that document? That's my first question. And then my second question is, we've heard about the father side of your family. So is your next book going to be about the mother side of your family?
Well, let's take it in piece. When you say manumission papers, what particular document are you referring to?
Yes, that's what you used to describe the document from the 1600s, which talked.
Okay, what that wasn't a manumission document in the traditional sense of what manumission documents came to be later. The institution of formal slavery was not structured as it became later. So this was a provision in a will in which Henry Adams provided for the freedom of two of his enslaved upon his death. And he died in 1686. And when he died in 1686, Henry Quander, who was maybe 10 years old, at that early age, he got his freedom, was set free. And he was sort of a surrogate son. I think that's probably more accurate to say. And Margaret Pug, who was a little older, maybe by 4 years. So they didn't get married right away. He was 10, she was about 14. And they got married a little bit after that, however, after it was, and had at least 3 children, 4 children that we know about. There may have been others not documented in the record. So that is what happened. Now, on my mother's side, it's a totally different story. My mother was from Barbados. Her father, my grandfather, is from Calcutta, India. And we have not kept up because when he left India and went to Barbados, my mother did not learn the language, and the contacts that were there initially were lost over time. And my mother's side is from Barbados, is English and Irish, a couple of drops of Afro-Caribbean plus Indian. So I'm a strong Christian Catholic on my father's side, but my mother, coming from Barbados, was a Catholic also, but her father was a very stern Orthodox Muslim. So I've been to India and I have walked with the land of the ancestors of crisscross where my grandfather and family were. And I know these are close cousins. These would be my mother's first cousins if they were still living, but I don't know any of them. So I have had to decide to let it go. However, my father's mother's people are from South Carolina, and they are very, very high people, if you want to call it that. Let's face it, they were enslaved. They were enslaved, but they were descended from sons and daughters of the American Revolution, very high. And I am qualified, but I've decided not to pursue it. But if you know the name Fraser or the name Pearson, the Frasers were major contributors to support of the American Revolution, and my ancestors' portrait is hanging in the Moore House, M-O-R-E, where they signed Cornwallis, signed the surrender documents in 1781. My ancestor, Frederick Fraser, is over the table hanging on the wall where they signed those documents. So that is all part of my father's mother's people from Walterboro, Colleton County, South Carolina. Yeah, so that too has been developed quite a bit. Well, my mother's family too, but going back into India, we don't have the language and we don't have the records. They're there, I'm sure, but we don't know.
Thank you.
That's where my name Rohulamin comes from.
I was wondering.
Yeah. Clyde, I'm sure didn't know that. Okay, anything else?
Fred looks like he's.
Yes.
Yep.
I really appreciate you coming on and sharing your history. It's very rich, and you got so much knowledge. I was just curious about the family being in Virginia versus Maryland. During the Civil War and after the Civil War, how would you say your family was able to continue to move forward, advance, and do the things that you've done on both sides of the river, considering that Virginia was such a strong Confederate stronghold, and some parts of Maryland were too. But I was just curious, can you share some light on that?
Well, I think part of it has to do with getting an early start. The family was able to acquire land in the 1600s, and that, of course, is very unusual, even though they didn't own it. It was a leasehold in the 1600s, and as the story goes, we had two men and boys brought here from the islands, quote unquote, presumably Barbados, and they were separated. In their oral history, the two brothers were separated, and one was under Henry Adams and got his freedom early under the will. The other stayed enslaved and didn't get his freedom until later. We carry the first name of Benjamin for that other brother, but we don't know if that's accurate, but that's been passed down. So eventually, those who were in Prince George, well, it wasn't Prince George, Charles County, Prince George hadn't been created yet. They began to emerge as farmers and entrepreneurs. There are a number of court cases, I didn't go into that, tax cases where they were suing, Quanders was suing for one thing or another, which showed an entrepreneurial spirit as far as building things and not getting paid and so on and so forth. And then on the Virginia side, some of the, it's believed, and it looks like it's true, that the first part is that migrated from Maryland over to the Virginia side, and they were free. And Nancy Carter of Mount Vernon, who was one of the Mount Vernon enslaved, she married into the Quander family. She married Charles Quander shortly after she got her freedom somewhere in the early 1800s, before 1810. And they were on the rise. Now, let's face it, let's be very upfront with it. If you were enslaved by George Washington, you're still enslaved, but you're carrying a certain recognized position in the community. And we in the Syphax family were there together. You may know the Syphax name. The Syphax ancestors, the Quander ancestors were at Mount Vernon together. But the difference is that the Quander ancestors were enslaved to George Washington, got their freedom under his will, even though it was postponed until Martha died. But the Syphax was Martha Washington's enslaved. So when George Washington died, Martha died, they were returned to the Custis family. They didn't get their freedom. Some were free, but most were not. And they ended up at Arlington House, enslaved, their children and grandchildren ended up enslaved to Robert E. Lee. So both families did have a visibility, and the Syphaxes had done extremely well. And but both families, we will have to admit, an advantage. But you see, we have this responsibility to lift others as we climb. We never claim to be the only, nor the best, nor the first. But we think, and we know it's important for our joint families, that we have an organization of the enslaved descendants, the Syphax, the Quanders, and others, to begin, and we're emerging now, to begin to point out, educate, as the Historical Society is designed to document, educate, and share. It's a 501c3 organization, the history of the family, but to be an inspiration to others.
Well, thank you so much. And I think that's a great note to end on. It certainly has been inspiring. Thank you again for sharing.
Well, I would certainly urge those. I'm in the business here.
Yep.
So I would love to be able to personally autograph a book, or maybe you'd like to buy a whole gross of them to you.
I'll put up the slide again with
There
the
it is.
information.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure.